Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Appreciate the invitation. Appreciate all of you because you are the first rank in this country. I covered the fall of the Berlin Wall. I covered the Hutu-Tutsi massacres in Africa. I covered the fall of Ceausescu, the end of the Soviet Union. And I can tell you in every country there's a small group of people who start doing things first, and I count you among those in this country. And also John Judge and COPA playing a tremendously important role in all of this. I'm going to try to do this. I did a similar, if anybody heard me at another place across town, I apologize. I have to do this in half the time here, so I'm going to try to do it. I'm going to first waste a little bit of time, not waste it, but just take a second to acknowledge a lady here sitting in the front row by the name of Frances Sissy Farenthold. If you don't know who she is, she's a pioneer of Texas and national politics, a great campaigner for human rights. Sissy was the only woman in the Texas State House of Representatives when she was in there in 1968. She also was the third woman in American history to have her name placed in nomination for the Vice Presidency of the United States. This is Sissy Farenthold right here. Please stand up, Sissy, so they can see you. She didn't know I was going to do that. Okay. So I'm going to, first of all, how many, next slide, please. Okay, how many of you know this book? Just so I can get an idea. Okay, a lot of you. Okay, the reason I ask is, I'm sorry, many people asked me for copies of the book. It's not here. I asked a bookseller, he said there was insufficient demand for it. So misinformation starts at home. Okay. How many of you, this is a question, how many of you think it matters whether a future president of the United States knew about and possibly participated in some way with the overthrow and murder of another president? How many don't think that matters? I thought I saw one hand go up. Okay. For some reason, people researching the assassination have largely failed to focus on this, and to my mind, it is this failure that prevents the overall mystery from being solved. Because if you've got a man who became president and his son became president and a third son may yet become president, and you're not interested in how that all happened and why he can't remember where he was on November 22, you are missing something in the big picture. I would argue that there is no more important aspect to solving the Kennedy assassination than the matter of George H.W. Bush and his activities and whereabouts on 11/22, because unlike the other debate, which is all very important, it is very, very important over ballistics, forensics, or the identity of one gunman or another, or who was where at what time, or over which branch of the establishment may have taken the lead in planning the coup. Here we have hard and fast evidence of the establishment actually being involved, not just in the cover-up, but in the murder and coup itself. I believe I demonstrate that effectively in my book, Family of Secrets. I have since then, to the satisfaction of some and perhaps not others, become a little bolder in my assertions about what I think was going on as I've attained additional clarity. I try in my work to be very, very careful and not go one step beyond where I feel I can go. I now feel I can go a little bit further. I also want to say that the establishment, including some journalists associated with JFK research, have gone from initially denying that Bush was even in the CIA before he became director in late 1975 and served a single year, to admitting, well, okay, maybe he did have a long and secret career as a CIA operative, but so what? And then they've even admitted in some cases, yeah, maybe he obscured the fact that he was in Dallas, but so what? Just a coincidence. And even, okay, maybe it is troubling, but I still think he doesn't have anything to do with any of these events. Yet the evidence is nothing short of overwhelming. So let's go through a few particulars. First of all, you know, he claimed he couldn't remember where he was on November 22, 1963. And he wasn't expecting the question. It was from a foreign television crew, and they were just asking him this very softball question about his recollections of history as an important man, and he just kind of froze. And so I'm not going to focus on the fact that he said he couldn't remember. I'm just going to focus on where was he, which I think is really the question. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is him calling the FBI on November 22, and he says, I'm George H.W. Bush. Here's my home address. I'm in the oil business, full of Zapata, offshore. He fully identifies himself, and then he says, I hear the president has been shot. Actually, the president had already died by then. And he said, I'd like to give some information about a man who I believe has been threatening to harm the president. So here he is doing his patriotic duty, rather unusually. I don't think most people called and said they might have a suspect. But this is the same guy who also claimed he couldn't remember where he was that day. So Exhibit A there. Okay. He was connected to a, next slide, please. Okay, this is Brown Brothers Harriman. This is the family banking institution, still very important today, perhaps the most influential private investment banking firm in the United States. Prescott Bush is at one of those desks in the back. His partners were the Harriman brothers, scions of an extremely powerful and important dynasty in railroads and banking and all kinds of other things. They were connected with them. The Bush family, including Prescott, George H.W., et cetera, were in a singularly unique position which tied them at the center of a spider web to virtually every element and aspect of the story. They were almost directly connected to and personally knew all the people you're interested in, and I mean all of them. They knew all of them. They knew the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They knew the CIA people. They knew the right wing. They knew the Republican establishment. They knew the bankers. They knew the oil people. They knew the Cuban exiles, as we will see. They knew everybody, everybody. Next slide, please. That's Prescott. Next. Business partner, Averell Harriman. By the way, they always had one person when it was a Republican and one in when it was a Democrat. They would just alternate, but they were still doing business together. Next slide, please. That's Skull and Bones. A lot of people like to make fun of that. The members take it very seriously, only 14 of them a year. Prescott Bush, his son George H.W., his son George W. members, Averell and Roland Harriman members, Henry Luce, the head of Time Life, which locked up the Zapruder film, member of Skull and Bones. You can use your imagination on the kinds of oaths and so forth that they share, including John Kerry, 2004 presidential election, John Kerry and George W. Bush, both nominees and both members of Skull and Bones. John Kerry recently said he doesn't believe Oswald acted alone. He thinks he was working for the Cubans. Okay. All right, very helpful. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we are told that George, by the way, I have no concept of time at all, so if I'm going late or you're bored or something, just flag me and I will, okay. All right, Bush family, and my mother says I talk too fast, so slow me down if I need to slow down. Bush family, they like to tell the story that George H.W. came out on his own and made it the hard way in the hard scrabble fields of West Texas. But in fact, here's the family corporate plane dropping him off. 3 generations there. Okay. Prescott Bush, U.S. Senator in the U.S. Senate at the same time as John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. These are things that are not in my book, and it really dawned on me that this is more and more important. He was in the U.S. Senate with these people for years. He and Lyndon Johnson had to work well together for years. He saw Jack Kennedy up close for years when Jack Kennedy was giving all those speeches in the early 1950s, which are not in any of your textbooks or your mainstream media reports, where he was saying, let these third world countries do their own thing. Well, you can imagine how Prescott and his buddies who owned all those mines felt about that. A very close friend, very, 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 very close friend of Allen Dulles. That's important. Prescott Bush, Allen Dulles, like that. Doing business together all the time on behalf of the same interests for many, many years. Dulles close with LBJ, Prescott close with LBJ, all working together on the oil depletion allowance, which Kennedy wanted to get rid of. Okay. Next slide, please. Dulles with Lyndon Johnson down on the ranch. Dulles always wears a suit, I guess. Okay. Prescott served on the Banking and Armed Services Committees. So who's he in touch with? Okay. This is during this whole period. Prescott served on the board of CBS. Okay. CBS, very, very tight with the CIA. He was involved with the military, the jet contract scandals. You probably all know about that involving General Dynamics. If you've read A Family of Secrets, you know I have a whole section about how Lee Harvey Oswald's best friend, George de Mohrenschildt, being grilled there by a man, spends an entire day and never asks him a single good question. They call that running out the clock. A guy named Albert Jenner. Albert Jenner was the lawyer for General Dynamics, which was being investigated and stood to go out of business if the Kennedys stayed in office. What the heck? Next slide. Okay, who's in charge here? Is it Nixon? Guy on the right, Prescott Bush. Hey, buddy. Nixon's got what they call, rudely, a shit-eating grin. He's got to put up with this guy. And what I discovered in my 5 years of research for Family of Secrets, and it's all documented in there, and I've literally, it's never been anywhere else before, is that Richard Nixon's political career began when Prescott Bush flew out to California and chose him to run for the House of Representatives to knock out a man who was involved with very powerful banking regulation that Brown Brothers Harriman did not like. Okay. Richard Nixon was created and controlled by the Bushes. He resented them. Meyer Danny, I think we have a different opinion on Watergate. I have 3 chapters suggesting that Richard Nixon ended up being too big for his britches and being removed by the same people that took out Jack Kennedy. Okay, Nixon. Okay, next slide. Oh, there's Nixon again with another Bush. Now it's Nixon taking care of a Bush. Poppy Bush, admittedly, has no qualifications for anything, no vision for anything. By his own admission, when he was named by Nixon to be the UN ambassador, he wrote a letter and he said his friend, who was a Democrat, also in Skull and Bones, Democrats, Republicans, wrote him, he said, "What the heck do you know about being a UN ambassador?" To which Bush replied, "Ask me in 2 weeks." They thought this stuff was funny. Gives you an idea where the policies come from. Prescott Bush was a close friend and collaborator with Senator Robert Kerr. If you haven't heard of him, he was the most important point man in the U.S. Senate for the oil industry. Okay, and Robert Kerr was very powerful with Lyndon Johnson. Some people think he told Lyndon Johnson what to do. But when Lyndon Johnson accepted the #2 post with Jack Kennedy, Kerr, in front of other people, wheeled on him and said, "I ought to pull out my .45 and shoot you right now." Already at the beginning, Kerr and the oil people did not like the fact that Johnson was cooperating in any way with Kennedy. He was a close friend. Prescott was a close friend with Douglas Dillon, who oversaw the Secret Service, head of the Treasury. They did business together. Must I go on? Probably not. Probably already out of time here. Poppy Bush ran a CIA front company for much of his adult life. And this is, again, not on the news, not on CNN, not on Anderson Cooper or anything else. The myth is that he was this guy who had no qualifications and no experience, and at the height of the Church Committee hearings investigating the CIA for illegal and immoral activities, they chose out of the entire world this man who couldn't finish a sentence and knew nothing about the CIA, George H.W. Bush. In fact, next slide, please. There's Prescott, rare photo, Prescott with John F. Kennedy at Yale. John Kennedy gave a speech, and he said, a lot of you guys here at Yale, I don't agree with you. Kind of a gutsy thing to do. I'm sure that endeared him to Prescott. Okay, next slide, please. Zapata Offshore, this is the CIA front company. If you look at their books, they never seem to turn a profit, and yet all these people like the Grahams of the Washington Post and so forth, they're all pumping huge amounts of money into them. You have to assume, unless they were stupid businessmen, somebody else was giving them the money to put in there. That little boy standing there, tow-headed George W. Bush, getting ready to join the family business. Okay, 1962, Prescott Bush, already running for re-election, already has campaign headquarters, suddenly announces he's withdrawing from the race. The reason doesn't really sound right to anybody, but his son, George H.W. Bush, in the oil business, suddenly gets into Texas politics. Both of them take radical shifts in their lives early 1962. That's important. Something is going on here. Next slide, please. Poppy on the campaign trail when he can't remember where he is, running for the U.S. Senate, attacking John F. Kennedy. Next slide, please. There's Barbara, back in her better days. Okay, and there they are voting. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is George de Mohrenschildt. You all know about him. I wrote about him extensively in Family of Secrets. Subsequently, additional books on de Mohrenschildt have come out. I don't fully agree with their conclusions about him. I would say unequivocally that he was an American intelligence asset of some great significance. He was the guy who spent about half a year out of the year before the assassination basically taking Lee Harvey Oswald to the dentist and babysitting and all these other things. He was a staunch anti-communist, and therefore, of course, he was endeared to the pro-communist Lee Harvey Oswald. He said that the reason he did it was because he was asked to do it by this man, J. Walton Moore, the head of the CIA contact office in Dallas. He said, he asked him, would you just keep an eye on this Oswald guy? And he said, okay. All right. Next slide, please. Those are the de Mohrenschildt. Mrs. de Mohrenschildt worked at a clothing company with her good friend Abraham Zapruder. Okay, we don't have time to get into that. Some other time, I'll tell you what I think. Next slide, please. D. Harold Bird looks like a nice guy. He owned a building called the Texas School Book Depository. He was a very big guy in the oil business, and he employed all kinds of people. He was a good friend of George de Mohrenschildt, Oswald's friend. And George, I discovered that in the fall of 1962, George de Mohrenschildt created a little charity, and they all would come over to his house and meet, and one of them was Mrs. Bird. Very interesting. And then, of course, you know, a year later, Oswald miraculously gets a job in Bird's building. Bird is not around because, next slide, please. Oh, wait, yeah, go next slide, please. Okay, he's off hunting in Africa. Big game hunter, never went abroad before, suddenly decided to go to Africa. He, later on when he came back, he asked for take the window out that Oswald supposedly shot from, and he kept that as a trophy. No fan of Kennedy. Go back one slide, please. Okay, there we are. This is something called the Louisiana Civil Air Patrol. That was a paramilitary group started by the Rockefellers and the local chapter, D. Harold Bird. And here we see a couple of guys on the left. His name is David Ferry with the circle around him, a character in the Kennedy assassination, a CIA operative. And on the right is Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay. Okay, so Bird runs this outfit. Bird owns the building. Okay, I don't do any more with that. Next slide, please. Jack Creighton. Texas, you all pronounce things differently here. It's pronounced Creighton, I was told, just like it's Murchison, not Murchison. Okay. He was the head of a military intelligence unit in Dallas. He's a very important figure in this whole assassination thing. He and George Bush were basically like running mates. They both were in the oil business, and they were both recruited by the same man to run for U.S. Senate and governor together. And they both were the nominees, and they both knew each other well, and I find him being invited to the George Bush White House. He was the head of 3 minutes. Oh, God. Okay. I only have 3 hours left to go here. He was the head of this military intelligence unit. He had an underground communications bunker below Fair Park here in Dallas. He was sharing office space there with the Dallas Police Department. About half of the Dallas Police Department were also members of his military intelligence unit. This has not been widely reported, but all these people knew each other. Okay. Next slide, please. I'm really just going to give up because it's so close. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Pepsi, Donald Kendall got Nixon to come there. Donald Kendall had 8,000 strangers in Dallas that day, no security at all. There's a bus with an ad for the bottlers convention going by Kennedy's car. They could have shot him out of the window. They also called up military vehicles to supposedly transport orphans to the state fair. Yeah, right. Okay, next slide. All right, now I'll get to what I really was going to talk about. I have no way to do this. Okay, this is called the Parrott Memo. This is, this is the Parrott Memo. That's Bush calling in his tip about this guy who might have wanted to shoot Kennedy. I found out that actually he knew Parrott very, very well because Parrott worked for him, and Bush's assistant was at Parrott's house, consorted doing business with him at the time, and then gave him an alibi. So there was a fake call to establish that Bush was a place called Tyler, Texas, an hour after the shooting. Ergo, he couldn't have been in Dallas at the time. Next slide, please. Never mind. Okay, next slide, please. Never mind her. That's a phony letter she sent. That's a dumb secret. Next one. Okay, this is J. Edgar Hoover. The day after the assassination, he says, we did a briefing for Mr. George Bush of the CIA about the Cuban exiles. I don't have time to explain it. What I figured out since the book came out, he says the State Department asked me to do this. I actually found, next slide, please. This is a book, how J. Edgar Hoover, when he wanted to do illegal domestic things, the way he would do it is he would say, the State Department asked me to do it. So the State Department has nothing to do with that now. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here's George Bush speaking in Dallas on the night of November 21. And where do you suppose he stayed? Did he go back to Houston that night? I don't think so. I think he stayed at Sheridan. That's where the Secret Service was headquartered. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, all these guys are connected. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, that's it. Thank you.